What is up, everybody? Welcome back to Rough Drafts, where I go deep each week on specific topics in the current limited format. My name is Sam Pratt. This week, we are talking about red cards. So the first however many weeks of the format, I realized I had been kind of subconsciously avoiding red in the drafts. I know on paper it's like supposed to be the worst color, but I was drafting the other day and I realized that I was looking at the red cards and in the pack, and they would have like good vibes to me, but I wouldn't take them just because I was telling myself, well, I don't really want to get into red unless I'm pushed into it. When I actually think that a lot of the red cards work really well with the other red cards, and I think you're leaving something on the table if you are consciously avoiding red, because I think there's something to all of the red cards playing with each other, and that's going to be the topic of today's episode. Red in most formats, just red as a color in Magic, is very classically aggressive and generally wants to play kind of a smaller game. Like you want to end the game pretty quickly, maybe get your opponent's life total down pretty low and finish them off with some burn spells. That is kind of promised with some of the archetypes and cards in this set, but I think that's generally a trap with red in this format, at least with red as a base color. I think it's really similar to Aether Drift in that respect. Like you have the white-red tap your creatures to station in this format, and you had white-red vehicles in Aether Drift build as this kind of super aggressive vehicles deck. I think that just like doesn't work. It doesn't line up well with what the other color pairs are doing in this format, what kind of the games are about, which often is these giant spacecraft in the air, kind of developing your board, protecting your life total. Red just doesn't really have the tools to play an aggressive game effectively, which leaves us with the question of what are we actually supposed to be doing with the red cards? And if you sort by game in hand win rate on 17 lands and you take the top chunk of red commons, you get the following cards. You get Orbital Plunge, which is the 4-mana deal 6 if you deal excess damage make a lander, which is the clear top red common by game in hand. Second is Nebula Dragon, which is the 7-mana 4/4 flyer when it enters deal 3, which is shocking. That's the second highest win rate red common. The card looked so bad in preview season, but it ended up being really sweet, and that's why we're talking about it today. Following Nebula Dragon, you have Kov Landseeker, the 4-mana 4/3 menace. When it enters, make a lander, and you sacrifice it at the end of your next turn. And Zookeeper Mechan, which is the 2-mana 1/3 mana dork with the pump ability. And after that, you also have Melded Moxite, which I think is a pretty good one too. That's the 2-mana artifact. When it enters, discard a card, draw 2 cards, and then you can sack it for 3 mana to make a tapped robot. If you take a look at the red cards as a whole in this format, there are a lot of cards like Rig for War, which is the +3/+0 combat trick. There's like Molecular Modifier, which is the 3-mana 2/2 that gives something first strike and +1/+0 every turn. There is, I can't even remember the name of the card, the 4-mana 3/3 haste that you can warp. There's a lot of things that are telling you, hey, you want to attack your opponent. Something like Plasma Bolt going phase 2. But if you look at the red cards that are actually performing well, they all point to wanting you to play like a big game, like a game where you are developing your mana and casting 7 drops. So obviously Nebula Dragon is your top end. You have Orbital Plunge and Kov Landseeker that give you lander tokens that you need to spend time. You need to sacrifice your own tempo to crack the lander tokens to develop your mana. You also have Zookeeper Mechan as a 1/3 that gives you mana. So there's a really nice package at common where you go like Zookeeper Mechan into turn 3, Orbital Plunge or Kov Landseeker, maybe crack the lander, and then you follow it up with Nebula Dragon or Pinnacle Killship as another comparable 7-mana top end card. This is not an aggressive game plan. This is a proactive game plan. Like you're not really setting up yourself in terms of interacting with your opponent for the first couple turns. You're developing this big mana so you can cast big splashy 7 drops that interact with your opponent's board, get you a big tempo advantage in the late game where you can kind of overwhelm them with their top end. But this is not about playing little guys, attacking your opponent, reducing their life total really early and finishing them off with some burn. So this took me a while to realize. It really clicked with me over the past week that all of these top red commons really work well with each other in this game plan of I'm going to develop my mana and cast big threats. One concept that I think about in a lot of limited formats that I think applies here to a couple different colors is the idea that of colors playing within themselves. where you're not just looking at the game plan of each color pair, like green, white does this, black, red does this. You're looking at the game plan of each individual color and seeing what the secondary color that you're going to add to that provides. This isn't applicable for every format or every color pair, but something like black in this format plays a very coherent, like small game, disruptive, attrition, like sacrifice plan. Like if you just take any core of black cards in this format, you can kind of add whatever secondary color you want. And you could see that like blue plays really well with that. Red plays a really good secondary color to these black cards. Green doesn't, which is one of the reasons why green-black is one of the worst performing decks in this format. And it took me a little while to figure out that red also plays very well with itself. This coherent game plan of Orbital Plunge, Kov Landseeker, Zookeeper Mechid, and some top end plays really nicely with itself. And I think the big thesis that I'm getting at with this episode is I think when you are in a base red deck, you want to build like Nebula Dragon is a good card in your deck. You want to build a game plan where Nebula Dragon can shine as your top end. And obviously, if you are a low to the ground aggressive deck, a 7-drop like Nebula Dragon is really not going to be what you want. Yes, it represents a lot of damage in the air. Yes, it deals 3 damage to face when you play it. But on the other hand, it's a 7-drop. If you're spending cards to develop your mana in your aggressive deck, that's not cards you're spending to deal damage to your opponent's face. So I really think that red, if you're playing it as a base red deck, and we'll get into how all the color pairs interact in this base red deck, you want all of your cards to kind of set up your Nebula Dragon, Pinnacle Killship sort of top end threats. You can kind of think of this like a stompy deck. Like a lot of stompy decks, like green, red, stompy in a lot of limited formats, are kind of off the back of 2-mana mana dorks. So if you can do the 2 to 4 skip and start playing like 4-drop, 5-drop, 6-drop from that point and just start attacking your opponent, that's a really good way to win a game of Magic with outscaled threats from your opponent. Red has the common mana dork in Zookeeper Mechid, which I think is a fantastic card. That pump ability really works to finish off your opponent, especially with a couple flyers or maybe Kov Landseeker that has menace. And I think you want to play red in this format like you're playing a green-red stompy deck. Because when you're putting your opponent on the back foot, a card like Nebula Dragon, which might be a little bit undersized just as a singular threat, but picks off one of your opponent's blockers, pushes damage, maybe it deals the last 3 points of damage in the air, maybe it deals them 3 points of damage and then is a lethal attacker itself the next turn. You want to be playing this big proactive plan. A couple of the other red commons that I like that fit into this vein, I mentioned Melded Moxite. One issue you can run into when you play these decks that are built on developing their mana and casting big threats is you might run out of things to do. You might flood basically because you have Zookeeper Mechid and landers, etc. Melded Moxite as sort of flood insurance, both as a way to discard excess lands, but also mana sink to sacrifice to create a robot later on. I think this card is really good. I'll play a couple copies in basically every red deck. Also has a lot of artifact synergies, which is another thing that your red deck may care about. Speaking of artifact synergies, Oreplate Pangolin. This is the 2-mana 2/2 artifact. When another artifact enters, you can pay 1 to get a +1/+1 counter on it. This is another card that, like, if you're spending all of your mana in the early turns to kind of push damage, you don't really have space for this to grow. But if you're playing this slower game where you're about developing your mana, this is a threat that comes down for cheap, sort of locks up the board for you in the early turns and can scale with the game as the game goes on. So I think this works really well with the red plan. Obviously, the better it is, the more artifacts you have in your deck. Plasma Bolt, this is the single mana deal 2 to any target at sorcery, and if you have Void online, it deals 3 instead. I just listened to the Mystical Dispute podcast episode where they talked about Plasma Bolt versus Gravkill, and Carl, 2Duck Cubed, made a lot of really good points about Plasma Bolt just stabilizing the board early when you're developing your mana. So like, say you play something that gives you a lander and then this lets you crack the lander, kill a 3 toughness thing in the same turn, as opposed to more clunky removal like Gravkill or Cut Propulsion, where you might have to spend your entire turn 4 or turn 5 just casting those cards to stabilize. When you're playing this bigger plan, the cheap removal often becomes better than the expensive removal, just because your things are naturally going to outscale your opponent. So you want to make sure that the way you don't lose is by getting run over early. So being a 1-mana play is really helpful, and Plasma Bolt plays really well with the landers that you get off of Orbital Plunge and Kov Landseeker. Another kind of top-end threat, I actually think this is worse than Nebula Dragon and Pinnacle Killship in a lot of situations, is Territorial Bruntar. It's a 6-mana 6/6 reach. It's an uncommon. When a land you control enters, exile cards from the top of your library until you hit a non-land, and you can play that card this turn. I still like this card. I'll talk about a blue-red deck that I had that kind of inspired this episode later, but I actually ended up cutting this for other 7-drops and ended up feeling really good about it. But I still think this is like a card that fits really nicely into this sort of big proactive vibe of these base red decks. So now I'm going to take a little bit of time going through each red color pair and just calling out a couple things I think you should keep in mind when building these as a base red deck, maybe how they're different than the base of the other color. I'm not going to spend too much time on each of these, just a couple points I want to point out. We'll start with red-green. I mentioned that you want to play red like it's a stompy deck, and obviously red-green is a really good home for that. A couple of interesting notes. Early on in the format, when I was doing really poorly, I was poking around 17 lands for stats on certain cards, and I was looking at Gene Pollinator. On 17 lands, if you click on the name of the card in the table, it will bring you to a page where it shows you how well the card is performing relative to each color pair's win rate. So if you click on Gene Pollinator, you will find that it overperforms in every green color combination except base red-green. Now, it doesn't really underperform. It's just kind of treading water as the average, so it's still a fine card to play. But this is proof that you don't really want to build your red-green decks like a Gene Pollinator deck. I think you're much more interested in Zookeeper Mechan, the more consistent, slower mana advantage that you get there. I think you really want to think about your red-green deck as all of your cards matter. And Gene is not really a card that quote-unquote matters. Like, you want your Oreplate Pangolin to be a threat that can grow that your opponent has to kill. Your Zookeeper Mechan to be something that's going to give you a huge mana advantage and then start pumping things in the late game. Your Kov Landseeker to be a threat that they have to double block, get blown up by removal spells, something like that. Gene doesn't really contribute to that as well as the other cards that develop your mana. I think red-green is relatively straightforward. You just want to play, just good big threats. A couple things to make sure you don't flood. I really like Melded Moxite basically in every red deck. Just really thought it was interesting that Gene specifically doesn't perform well in straight red-green. So let's talk about black-red. This is one where I think it actually suffers a little bit as a base red deck, because I think a lot of the red cards, like I've been saying, they want you to scale up in the game, get a lot of lands in play a lot of big threats. And in general, the black game plan in this format wants you to play a very small game, keeping the board small, using removal spells on your opponent's creatures, sacrificing your own stuff for value. Those things are quite at odds with one another. I think it's really similar to the dynamic between black and green. And I think because the black cards, just pound for pound, are slightly stronger than the red cards, I think you're generally going to come at black-red from the black side, playing this small black grindy plan with support cards like Kov Landseeker and Orbital Plunge that are kind of things that give you 2 rectangles that you can sacrifice, which is why I think the color pair still works. But there is a world in which you build this the other direction. You're just kind of playing black for like removal and maybe some nice chunky threats like Void Forged Titan. Blue-red, I think, is pretty similar, honestly. Like I mentioned that the red cards really want to play a big proactive game. I think blue tends to want to play more of a reactive game, both in Magic in general and in this format. Like Cryogen Relic is a fantastic card that you'll play in any blue deck, as many copies as you can get your hands on, but it's not really something that's putting pressure on the opponent. And I think is a little bit at odds with the red cards you would be putting in your deck, like to make a core of a base red deck. So this is another thing similar to black-red, where I think you're often going to be building this deck from the blue side and using the red cards as like your interaction, your things that make artifacts for your artifact synergies in this deck. I did have one blue-red deck that I trophied with in Best of 3 the other day. This is very much the inspiration for this episode. It's very much base red, go big. I had 3 Zookeeper Mechan. I had 4 7-drops. I had a Pinnacle Killship, a Nebula Dragon, and 2 Mouth of the Storms as my top end. This is the deck I cut the Territorial Bruntar from just to cut my top end down a little bit. I basically had no blue commons. I think I had a Cryo Shatter, maybe one other blue common. Oh yeah, I was playing an Ilvoy Light Jammer. But the deck actually had 0 Cryogen Relic, 0 Selfcraft Mechan. It was a really weird draft. I kind of got into the deck. I had like an Elegy Acolyte that I got passed in pack 2, so I was straddling between red-black and red-blue for most of the draft, and just kind of ended up like I had more blue cards at the end. I was able to build this as the base red plan and cast my Mouth of the Storms as my top end, which it ended up being very effective. So I think while your blue-red artifact decks are mostly going to come from the blue side, I do think there's something here with just the red core supplemented by some good blue cards. Which brings me to white-red. And this is one of the worst decks in the format. In the bottom 2 with black-green for sure. I think this is very, very similar to Aetherdrift white-red, where it's billed as this kind of aggressive synergy deck where you're using your spacecraft to tap your creatures, and they want you to put the really bad top-end red spacecraft in your deck, like the 6/5 that stations for 3 and has haste and stuff. I think you want to build your white-red decks like this red core, and just using some of the good white cards as like good, strong, proactive mid-range cards, which was actually very much the same thing in Aetherdrift. Like the white-red vehicles aggro deck was really bad unless you had like a really good version of it. But if you played it as like the base of a mid-range or control deck, I actually really liked white-red in that format, especially because there were a lot of good like white gold cards you could like splash, or there was like a really good white-red board wipe. So just a couple of big white-red cards that you can look at. There's a couple uncommons I want to mention. Dawnstrike Vanguard, which is the 6 mana 4/5 lifelink. End step, if you have 2 tapped creatures, you can put a 1/1 counter on all your creatures. I think this is like decent top end, depending on the matchup. I think similarly, like Sammy, the uncommon Sammy, the 2/4 that makes 2/2s if you have tapped creatures at the end of the turn. I think that's another card that like looks like it's an aggressive card because you want to attack. But I think just like a 2/4 that poops out 2/2s is just like a really good mid-range card too. And Zookeeper Mechan tapping itself can help you enable that without needing to enter the combat step early. And also your spacecraft, obviously. You want to like build with a little bit of this synergy. And just a white card that I love in this format, Sunstar Lightsmith. This is the 4 mana 3/3 in white at uncommon. When you cast your second spell, put a 1/1 counter on this creature and draw a card. Just a really fantastic card on its own. Doesn't take too much to like build around it because double spelling is good. You want to be putting cheap cards in your deck, even though I'm talking about going big. This is just like another singularly good mid-range threat that you can play in a slower white-red deck. And that's going to wrap it up. I had a lot of fun playing with the red cards this week. It really clicked for me why I shouldn't be avoiding red in this format. Just kind of like not being afraid to jump into red as a base color, as another option of things to do in the draft. So we actually only have 2 more weeks of Edge of Eternities. I'm going to have a grab bag episode next week, and then maybe another like half grab bag episode, half retrospective episode. And then we get to Spider-Man. And I have a plan for content during the pick 2 draft format. I'll get to that later. If you have any feedback for me, if you have anything that you want me to talk about in the grab bag episode next week, please reach out to me. You can find me on Blue Sky at sampratt.bsky.social. You can find me on Discord at samp6, and I stream occasionally on Twitch at samp_MTG. Thanks for listening. See you next week.